I come here from the United States, and in New York I have an order also of my practice of seeing patients or my groups. Coming here with new language, new people, puts everything upside down for me. And in many ways, that is another way I can create the climate for something new. But when I am working with a piece, an art piece, and I don't know what to do with it, I am stuck. Nothing seems to be happening. What goes on is I turn the piece upside down, and I see it completely new and different. And changing it all upside down is the possibility for something new to go on, because the perceptions get all shook up. And that's what the possibilities of therapy are. If you can shake up the perceptions, the set way of seeing things, turning things upside down, then you have the possibility of change. Well, let me tell you how things got turned upside down for me, and how art therapy began, at least for me, 23 years ago. It was around 1969, and already I was around 39, 40, and I was doing well in my practice, seeing patients and doing analytic practice. And I heard, in many respects, a voice saying, it is time to turn things upside down and to see what will happen. And sometimes you have to wait to see what the opportunity comes your way. And there was a colleague of mine who said, how would you like to teach psychology to artists at Pratt Institute? I had never taught before. And I said to him, it's all right if you schedule me at night, because I think at night they're not so smart. The smart ones go during the day. And I'm not quite sure how good a teacher I am. I had never taught before, and I wasn't quite sure how I'd do. So I prepared my notes, but this was a very strange crowd of artists I was teaching. They were unlike psychology groups. They did not like things in a nice, rational, logical order. And they kept on throwing me until I went with it. And I started to develop art exercises to teach them psychology. And then I said to myself, wouldn't this be a neat idea if I could change a little bit? I want to ask you a question. Do you think I need the mic? No. Leave it there. I may need something to hold on to. I may need some kind of object to give me security. And so I decided, let's see what would happen if we could develop the idea of artists doing therapy, because isn't it when you create something like therapy? Now, 23 years ago, it was in 1970, and it was just after the 60s, and the climate was, we could do anything. There was a period of change, a period of excitement, and what went on is that the climate at Pratt, though this was an art school, said, yes, let's try art therapy. Now, fortunately, they didn't ask me what was art therapy, because I had no idea. There were no books really written about art therapy. And it's interesting, in 1970, 3 other programs besides my own at Pratt developed an idea of art therapy, all independently, not knowing what the other one was doing, and 4 programs independently in 1970 started the first art therapy programs in the United States in terms of formal training. Now I had a wonderful opportunity. Since we didn't know what art therapy was, we were developing it on the spot. And whatever was happening, we was developing our theory. There were a few people around at that time. There was Margaret Nellenberg, who felt that if you develop a psychoanalytic perspective, you get insight because art becomes a format to get insight. And I thought that this was diluted psychotherapy. I didn't like that. And then there was Edith Kramer, who felt that art, if you give people a good art experience, the area of sublimation becomes a very powerful therapeutic tool. I didn't like that either. So what happened is that we decided to develop our own ideas. Now, should I take this symbolically or not? Okay. So, I listen to this symbol and I say, the hell with you. And this is what Edith Kramer and Margaret Naumberg, the ghosts are coming to haunt me, because they were very upset with us because we did not follow their ideas. And these were early pioneers who put their soul and heart into it. And then we upstarts, like myself, come in and say, we're going to do something new. As arrogant as could be, but sometimes arrogance can be positive and not always obnoxious. Because what we were doing was daring to see if we could take a risk and do something different. Well, lo and behold, we have this art therapy program. And we have the first meeting of the art therapists. These 4 programs come together. And you know, when we start a new program, you get people walking into your department. They don't know why. It looks interesting. And we had 4 people from food preparation services say to us, this looks interesting. I want to be in your program. But these people had no art background. And of course, it's 1970s, and I say, why not? And I didn't know what somebody with food background can do. But we put them in a veterans hospital, and they formed a catering unit with the veterans, providing the veterans to develop interesting dishes creatively and going out and preparing it for different people. And I said, that's art therapy. Well, I asked, okay, do you know what bagels are? And he said, I never heard of bagels. And bagels are like a round donut made of bread with cream cheese in the United States. Very, very big thing in New York City. On 79th Street and Broadway, if you're ever there, go there, you get good bagels. And this head of this other department says to us, my grandmother makes bagels, but that's not art therapy. And so we were labeled the bagel makers of the Eastern Art Therapy Group. And that's how we became, because we were seen as this wild group who was willing to experiment. Well, this wildness or willing to experiment started much earlier, and as a result, I must bring you back many, many years to tell you the genesis of how this all began. Picture, if you will, a very dirty little boy playing in the sandbox. Now, this dirty little boy had a very secret interest. I love to plug up drains with my sand. And when my mother was not looking, I would take my sand into the drain, plug it up, so I make a big puddle. Now, this did not go over well with my mother. Certainly, she did not know the symbolic meaning of my pushing up drains. But this dirty little boy knew. This dirty little boy knew that I had to try to cause trouble to see what trouble would bring. And so I would often, we have in the United States called fire alarm boxes, where you pull it down and it makes a lot of noise. Well, my mother was not looking. That's where I would go and pull the fire alarm. She would drag me into the corner, into the store, make believe I had not done this as the fire trucks would come in, and make sure I would not go there again. But I am interested in pulling down levers to see what will happen, and plugging up drains, and building up sandcastles. Now, there are many dynamics behind this, but one of the parts of my family dynamics is I come from a very artistic family. My father made something that is no longer done in my country called, he made artificial flowers for women's hats. And he would bring in his newest creation, and my mother and sister, they would talk about it. And certainly this was not my world. I was out in the sandbox. And it was a very artistic family. My sister later became an interior decorator, living in Montreal. And they would discuss how things could be made beautiful. And I grew up with the notion that artistic and aesthetic has something to do with beauty. And beauty was not my world. My world was chaos, was debris, was things not coming together quite. I was not a very orderly, certainly not an artistic child. Well, another part of the dynamic is that a hidden part of my family, who were called the no-gooders, were my father's brothers. 3 of them plus 1 sister, who were psychoanalysts in the country, but psychoanalysts who were not doctors, were not seen as very acceptable then. So they were seen as doing something underhanded. Besides, they were my father's relatives, so they could not be any good. But they were very interested because they were involved with Freud, and frankly, I was involved with sex, and how else could I find anything about sex but going and reading something about Freud? But that's not the kind of sex I was interested in. But that wasn't what I was looking for, but somehow I got converted along the way. I became a psychologist very early, I think at 23, 24. I got my doctorate, much to my mother's surprise. And I knew then very early, as soon as I came back from the Army, I was going to go into psychoanalytic training. And as part of my analytic exploration, I had to rediscover that child in the sandbox and utilize that child in the sandbox. And there was a split inside of me between the male world, even though my father was part of the women's world, and which represented psychology, which I opted for, and that world of beauty, which was making things look nice. And out of this experience, where I don't know, I wanted to go and take a sculpting course. And as part of this analytic exploration, I enrolled in a sculpting course. I took my wife along with me for support because I was very frightened of going into this place. And I peeked into the door from the side, and there was this old Russian lady who looked at me and she said, "Vel, what are you waiting for?" So she caught me looking in, so I came in, and something wonderful happened. The smell of clay and stone and wood. The smell of a studio was erotic. It was exciting. It was sexual. And it was something that touched me. And what happened is that everything I started to work with, my art teacher would come with approval, with joy, and only spurred me on to do even more. And I went from one thing to another. And I went first with clay, then with stone, and finally with metal. And right now, I would be commonly called a junk sculptor, because I love to go to junkyards. And that's part of creation for me. And I take a piece of junk here, and a piece of junk here, and as I pick up this so that it touches the junk in my unconscious. And somewhere I know this junk I'm going to rediscover in some form of piece of art that I will weld together. Now, along with this, about this time that the art therapy program starts, I get involved in sculpting, and my father dies. I had already finished my analysis. I was a practicing analyst. I was very disturbed by this experience. He had died of cancer. It was a long, difficult cancer. And I put together my experience of what it felt like to go through the mourning of my father. And I brought in the piece to my analyst. And I'd like to show you this first piece. Okay. Now, he picks up the piece, holds it back and forth, and he says, you know, Art, it's a very balanced piece. And it's a very fair piece. That big open gaping hole there is a hole, by the way, that I will experience over and over again in my artwork, and I will tell you more about it. But it is an unusual piece for me because it is so balanced. And he says to me, are you sure, Art, that you're not trying to balance things in your life and make things just a little too neat? Is all you feel is sadness about your father's death? And I had to admit no. A part of me was relieved that he had died and I could go on. And there was a sense of relief when we started to speak about this, that I did not feel obligated to only feel pain, but to feel release as well. And that this started my own personal art therapy, because what I saw in this is that not every art piece is just expressive. An art piece can hide as well as express. And that in an art piece, we hide things as well as show things. And that our defenses are in the art piece as well as the inner part. And that for those of you who think that only the art piece or any kind of modality just shows what's inside, no, that's not so. Because anything we can do, like anything else, can hide, can protect, as well as expose. And that started a whole line of thinking of how to work with art, with the protections we use, how we hide, how we expose, and how to work both with the protections, our defenses, as well as how to bring out what is inside. Now, along with this, I started my own work in my personal art. Just go on up too. And I started to learn that you can put many things together And this is one of my first pieces. And it was the conception of a woman who was pregnant who also created a sliding pond. And that you could slide right down her belly. And I started to kind of recognize that you can put your own craziness in any kind of art piece and reshape it so that something new comes out of it. And I started to play with images that came up from nowhere. Where, I don't know where they came from. But I did not think what I was going to do. What happened is that it rose up inside of me and I gave it shape. And I learned that in art therapy, or like any creation, if you are present and if you're in it and you are letting something come up rather than thinking what you're going to do, then there's a kind of play of going inside your art piece and shaping it so that there's a rhythm that is when you are one with the piece and you're in it, and then as you're in it, you slowly move out and start shaping it. So that there's a rhythm and a dialogue of oneness and separateness. Now that same rhythm goes on in therapy, and that is the rhythm of contact, of making a contact where you are one with your patient and yet separate. And every piece of material, you have a different rhythm. Clay created one kind of rhythm, stone another, metal another. And that some patients, I could not find the rhythm. And that the problems of rhythm, I later found out, are really where the province of therapy is all about. And that is the problems of dysrhythmia, the problems of where you cannot find your own rhythm of living, of being one and yet separate, which is really taking something in, becoming part of it, and then shaping it for yourself. It is like an identity process, shaping and reshaping, giving birth and rediscovery, and getting part from it and finding something new.